History often feels inevitable, as if the path of nations is carved into stone, yet the story of America could have turned in countless directions. And in this telling, we will follow a different course, one where choices made in moments of uncertainty ripple outward, shaping a nation unlike the one we know. It begins in the summer of 1776, when 13 colonies stood at the edge of rebellion. But in this version, they were not alone, for the winds of discontent carried north into the lands of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, where hardship under British rule and resentment toward taxation stirred a willingness to break free. When American privateers struck their harbors, it did not drive them deeper into loyalty to the crown, but instead awakened the possibility of union with their southern neighbors. And so, when independence was declared, the banner of freedom rose not above 13 stars, but 14, a symbol of broader solidarity. The war for independence was hard fought, yet with greater numbers and northern ports providing shelter for American ships, the revolution ended sooner. By 1781, Britain recognized defeat across a larger stretch of land than in our reality, seceding control of territory beyond the Appalachian frontier all the way to the Mississippi River, and opening paths for a continental nation to emerge earlier and stronger than before. In the years that followed, leaders debated what kind of republic they were building. Some argued for caution and isolation, believing that entangling alliances would corrupt liberty, but others envisioned a nation of vigor, reaching outward across seas and continents with ambition and determination. In this alternate timeline, it was the latter vision that gained momentum early. When President Jefferson purchased Louisiana in 1803, he did not stop with land alone. He invested in a stronger navy and established permanent garrisons, believing that a young republic needed more than ideals to secure its survival. As Europe convulsed in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain once again threatened American trade, impressing sailors and blockading ships. Yet here the United States struck decisively. Rather than merely endure provocation, by 1812, American armies were better organized, with the militias of the northern states united in promise of expanded borders. Their target was not only defense, but conquest of Canada itself. The war was brief. The combination of British distraction in Europe and American control of the St. Lawrence River sealed the outcome. Within 2 summers, British commanders conceded defeat, paying reparations and abandoning nearly all of their continental claims north of the Great Lakes. The dream of a continental republic was no longer fantasy. The United States now stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Hudson Bay, with settlers flowing into territories once thought untouchable. This expansion created new challenges for unity. The delicate balance between free and slave states threatened to unravel the fragile trust holding the Union together. Yet in this timeline, a compromise was struck. By integrating Canada as several states whose climates and economies made slavery unprofitable, this lessened the pressure that historically pushed the South to defend its institutions so fiercely. Slavery still existed, but without the same expansionist drive, its hold began to weaken earlier than in the timeline we know. Meanwhile, the indigenous nations of the continent faced an altered fate. Rather than wholesale removal and forced marches westward, courts ruled that tribes who embraced Christianity, literacy, and settled agriculture could remain upon their ancestral lands, recognized as citizens in time. This precedent allowed several groups, including the Cherokee and Creek, to establish semi-autonomous states within the Union, where traditions endured alongside new institutions. While conflict still flared, assimilation was not erased, but the most violent displacements never came to pass. By the 1830s, with Mexico unstable under Santa Anna, and with Texas clamoring for support, American leaders faced the question of intervention. The United States entered the conflict earlier than in our world, sweeping through northern Mexico with startling speed. Yet instead of halting at the Rio Grande, they pressed further, occupying Mexico City itself. Faced with the collapse of authority, local republics in Yucatan and the Rio Grande petitioned for annexation. In this alternate path, Washington accepted the requests. Thus, by mid-century, the United States commanded not only the plains and forests of the north, but also the deserts and mountains of Mexico, vast and diverse lands whose cultures added complexity to the growing republic. It was not a seamless union. Resistance simmered in towns where Spanish remained the native tongue, and Southern planters dreamed of new slave territories. Yet climate and local opposition blunted those ambitions, leaving slavery trapped within its old boundaries. Tensions between North and South still grew, but without the same depth of grievance that led to a civil war in our timeline. Instead, regional friction gave way to political compromise, as new states were carved from Mexican territories and balanced with northern ones. Though violence like Bleeding Kansas still erupted, the Union endured without a devastating fratricidal war. By the dawn of the 1850s, America was already unrecognizable compared to the nation we know. A sprawling federation of English and Spanish speakers, stretching from the Arctic waters to the volcanic heart of Mexico, from the Atlantic coast to the Rockies and beyond. Its people diverse, its ambitions limitless. The seeds of its global role were planted far earlier. As the Union spread south and west, the question of identity pressed harder upon the people of the Republic. Were they a nation of states loosely bound by common defense, or were they becoming a vast empire of democracy that stretched across climates, languages, and traditions? In this altered history, it was the latter vision that prevailed, though not without tension. The admission of Mexican territories as states forced leaders in Washington to reconsider their institutions. Laws were translated into Spanish alongside English in federal documents. Courts recognized bilingual proceedings, and churches blended Catholic and Protestant traditions into the public sphere. This fostered friction in New England and the Deep South, where cultural purists demanded that America remain solely Anglo-Protestant. Yet the sheer weight of numbers made that impossible. The Republic had become multi-ethnic far earlier than in our reality, and the fusion of cultures gave rise to a new generation that called itself simply American, no matter the language of their ancestors. Economically, the new lands were both a blessing and a burden. Rich silver mines, timber, and fertile valleys promised prosperity, yet the costs of governing such a vast area strained the treasury to its limits. Congress debated endless tariffs and subsidies while railroads stretched like iron veins across wilderness, connecting northern factories to southern ports and Mexican heartlands to New York markets. In this America, industrialization did not center solely on the Northeast, but bloomed as well along the Gulf of Mexico, in Veracruz and Tampico, where shipyards and textile mills flourished. Workers of Irish, German, Italian, and Mexican descent labored side by side, forging steel and shaping a shared destiny. By mid-century, the currents of reform swept across the land, just as they had in our reality. Abolitionists raised their voices not only in Boston, but also in Mexico City, where freedmen's societies allied with mestizo intellectuals, demanding the gradual end of slavery. Their cause gained momentum because slavery had never taken deep root in the new Mexican states, and without fertile cotton fields to sustain the system, the South found itself increasingly isolated from the economic mainstream. This created pressure that in another world might have sparked a bloody war, yet here it pushed Southern leaders to negotiate. Fearing irrelevance, they agreed to a gradual emancipation plan supported by federal compensation and land grants to former slaves. This plan was not perfect. Prejudice still ran deep, and freedmen often faced hostility, yet they were not shackled by the terror of Reconstruction or the chains of Jim Crow, for federal protection remained strong. Military posts were maintained throughout the South and Mexico alike, ensuring that equal rights, though fragile, were defended by force of law. This presence also discouraged secession. The nightmare of civil war that consumed our history never reached the same magnitude in this version. While domestic struggles occupied much attention, the world beyond America's shores stirred restlessly. Europe was once again engulfed in conflicts as revolutions spread and empires collided. Unlike the America we know, this union chose not to shy away from foreign affairs. Secure in its vast resources, it began to see itself as a guardian of Republican ideals overseas. When Cuban rebels rose against Spain in the 1850s, Washington offered aid openly, sending weapons, volunteers, and naval squadrons into the Caribbean. Spain protested furiously, yet exhausted by European wars, it could not withstand American pressure, and soon Cuba too was drawn into the orbit of the Union. By 1860, the United States stretched across more land and controlled more people than any nation save Russia. Its population diverse, its institutions tested and reshaped by the strains of inclusion. The census revealed an America where nearly half of citizens spoke more than one language, where Catholic parishes stood beside Baptist chapels, and where city streets echoed with German, Italian, Chinese, and Spanish alongside English. In this cacophony of voices, a new sense of belonging grew, a conviction that liberty was not the property of one people, but of all who lived under the stars and stripes. Culturally, this diversity produced tensions, yet also vibrancy. Artists in New Orleans painted murals blending Aztec motifs with classical European themes. Poets in Quebec wrote epics of northern landscapes that became beloved across the Republic, and Mexican ballads were sung in Kansas taverns. The fusion of traditions created a culture uniquely American, vast, colorful, and impossible to confine to any single heritage. Still, dangers loomed. The expansion into Central America stirred resentment among local populations, who feared domination by their northern neighbor. Rebellions flared in Guatemala and Honduras, where independence fighters sought to resist annexation. Washington responded with a mixture of force and compromise, offering paths to statehood alongside military suppression. Over time, many of these lands were drawn into the Union, yet resentment simmered just below the surface, laying seeds for future discord. On the Pacific coast, meanwhile, American settlers pressed relentlessly into California, Oregon, and beyond, reaching the shores of the Pacific by the 1850s. Gold rushes transformed sleepy settlements into bustling cities, drawing immigrants from Asia in numbers far greater than in our timeline. Chinese workers built railroads, Mexican miners sought fortune, and Japanese merchants established communities in San Francisco. This early Pacific dynamism gave America a gateway to Asia sooner and stronger than in our reality. By the dawn of the 1860s, the Union was immense, powerful, and restless. Its leaders looked outward towards oceans and inward towards integration, balancing the needs of countless peoples and regions. The great question was no longer whether America could survive, but rather what kind of empire it was becoming, an empire of liberty or an empire of dominion. The choices made in these years would define the path ahead. As the 1860s unfolded, the world beyond America grew darker. Europe convulsed with wars of unification and empire, while Asia strained under foreign powers. Yet across the Atlantic, the Union remained remarkably secure, vast in territory, rich in resources, and guarded by oceans. Its people felt destiny calling them to rise as a global power. The decision to intervene in Mexico decades earlier had reshaped the balance of the continent, with the South bound by gradual emancipation and the North empowered by industry. The Republic entered the new era without the devastating scars of civil war that marred our reality. Instead of fields burned and cities in ruin, railroads expanded rapidly, connecting Chicago to Mexico City and New Orleans to San Francisco. Commerce flourished as goods flowed freely along iron tracks. Grain from the Midwest mingled with silver from Zacatecas, and lumber from the Canadian forests poured into shipyards along the Gulf. This fusion of economies created prosperity at a scale unknown in any other land. In Washington, leaders debated the nature of this prosperity. Some warned against empire, fearing that foreign entanglements would erode the Republican soul. But others argued that destiny demanded expansion. They saw the Caribbean as an American lake, the Pacific as a gateway to Asia, and Latin America as a partner in a grand federation of republics. This idea, called Pan-Americanism, gained strength as Cuban leaders pressed for admission and Colombian envoys sought economic alliance. In this alternate path, the United States extended hands of cooperation while quietly tightening its grip. The 1870s brought immense demographic change. Millions poured across the Atlantic from Italy, Germany, Ireland, and Scandinavia, settling not only in New York or Boston, but in Veracruz, Havana, and Quebec. The cultural mosaic widened further, with schools offering lessons in multiple languages. newspapers printing editions in Spanish, German, and Italian, and cities echoing with a chorus of dialects. This diversity did not erase conflict. Riots still erupted in ports, where nativists demanded English-only policies. But the sheer scale of immigration forced compromise over time. The Republic learned to bend rather than break, absorbing waves of humanity into its structure. Meanwhile, the indigenous nations continued their complex integration into the Union. While many tribes retained lands and autonomy, others resisted fiercely, particularly across the Great Plains, where Lakota and Comanche warriors clashed with settlers and soldiers in prolonged campaigns. Eventually, railroads and sheer numbers overwhelmed resistance, yet instead of total displacement, federal treaties recognized several autonomous tribal republics with rights to representation in Congress. Though limited, these agreements offered a degree of dignity that history otherwise denied. Economically, the Gilded Age struck earlier and brighter than in our world, with silver mines in Mexico, oil fields in Texas, and fertile farms across Canada. The Republic generated unprecedented wealth. Tycoons rose in every region, from industrialists in Quebec to plantation owners turned capitalists in Mississippi to railroad magnates in California. This wealth also deepened inequality. Tenements in Mexico City and New Orleans overflowed with workers, while gilded mansions gleamed along the Hudson River and San Francisco Bay. The contrast stirred unrest. Labor strikes grew common, and populist leaders demanded reform, laying the groundwork for a different kind of politics. Foreign policy, too, shifted boldly. When European powers carved Africa into colonies, American leaders chose another course. Rather than colonizing overseas, they invested heavily in Central America, securing the Nicaraguan Canal decades before our reality did. This project transformed world trade, linking Atlantic and Pacific routes under American control. The canal brought enormous wealth and strategic dominance, cementing the Union's role as the beating heart of global commerce. By the 1880s, New York, Veracruz, and San Francisco stood as the busiest ports on Earth. The Spanish Empire crumbled under pressure, not only from Europe, but from the relentless expansion of the Union. Spain's last hold on the Americas faded as Puerto Rico and the Philippines fell into crisis. Yet, unlike in our history, America showed little interest in Asia, focused instead on consolidating the Western Hemisphere. Puerto Rico was annexed, while the Philippines were purchased by France, avoiding entanglements in the Pacific Wars. This choice allowed America to keep its attention firmly upon the Americas, ensuring dominance over its hemisphere without overreach. By the late 19th century, the Republic was a colossus, stretching from the frozen waters of the Arctic to the tropical jungles of Nicaragua. Its population surpassed 100 million, its army professional, and its navy second only to Britain. Yet, unlike Europe, which seemed addicted to endless wars, the United States prided itself on peace at home. No continent-wide civil war, no massive destruction. Instead, the greatest battles were political debates over immigration, over labor rights, over the role of states versus federal power. Culturally, the late century blossomed into a golden age. Writers from Mexico blended romanticism with frontier tales, poets in Quebec penned epics that rivaled those of Europe, and musicians from Havana and New Orleans created rhythms that electrified the world. Jazz, born decades early, spread like wildfire, uniting diverse peoples in shared expression. Cities were proud and distinct. San Francisco with its Pacific gateways, Quebec with its French charm,
Mexico City with its blend of Aztec heritage and Republican modernity, New York with its towering skyline already piercing the heavens, each city a jewel in a crown of unparalleled diversity. As the century closed, observers abroad spoke with awe and fear. Some saw the Union as a beacon of liberty, proving that democracy could thrive across cultures, languages, and continents. Others whispered of empire, warning that no nation so large and powerful could resist the temptations of domination. Both views held true, for America now stood at a crossroads. It had conquered its continent, avoided its civil war, and built a federation unlike any other. But the 20th century loomed ahead, with challenges unseen. Wars, revolutions, ideologies, and global rivalries, and the path chosen in those years would determine whether the Republic remained a guardian of liberty or transformed into something far more formidable.
The dawn of the 20th century found the Union vast, confident, and restless, from the northern snows of Hudson Bay to the steaming jungles of Nicaragua, from the Atlantic harbors of Boston and Havana to the Pacific gates of San Francisco and Vancouver. The nation pulsed with energy. It had avoided the shattering wound of civil war that scarred so many other lands. It had absorbed waves of immigrants without collapsing, and it had expanded until it was the most extensive federation on earth. Now the question before it was what role it would play in the wider world. Europe once again drifted toward conflict. Alliances hardened, empires rattled sabers, and the Balkans smoldered. Yet across the ocean, America held firm to a doctrine of guarded neutrality. Unlike the timeline we know, this union had no reason to join wars across the sea. Its wealth came not from entangling itself in European rivalries, but from trade across the Americas, from railways that crisscrossed a continent, and from the Nicaraguan canal that linked oceans and poured gold into federal coffers. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Americans watched with sorrow, but not with intervention. Instead, they traded with both sides, supplying wheat, steel, and oil while keeping soldiers at home. This decision reshaped the century. Without American entry, the war dragged longer, but ended with exhaustion rather than decisive victory. Europe was bloodied, drained, and fractured, while America remained untouched and stronger than ever. Its cities gleamed, its factories roared, its ships carried goods to every port. By the 1920s, while Europe stumbled into depression, the Union basked in prosperity, not the fragile, roaring 20s of our history, but a steadier growth, fueled by endless demand for American resources and manufactured goods. The social fabric, too, transformed. The presence of millions of Mexican and Central American citizens meant that Latinos stood at the heart of politics decades before our own reality. Afro-Americans who had been emancipated under gradual federal plans found wider opportunities in Western lands where military colonies had protected their rights. And though prejudice remained fierce, they built schools, businesses, and churches that anchored communities across the South and Midwest. Without the rise of Jim Crow, the struggle for equality took different form, more gradual, less explosive, but carried on by generations determined to claim full rights. Culturally, this diverse union thrived in ways unimaginable in our world. New Orleans, Havana, and Mexico City became centers of music and art, blending African rhythms with European instruments, birthing genres that would sweep the world before jazz or salsa were known in our timeline. Poets from Quebec and Havana shared stages with speakers from Boston and Chicago, creating a literary tradition that was unmistakably American, yet endlessly varied. Film, too, grew early and strong, with studios in Los Angeles, Veracruz, and Montreal competing to capture the imagination of a multi-ethnic audience. By mid-century, the Union faced its greatest test not from foreign invasion, but from ideology. As communism spread after revolutions in Europe and Asia, many feared that discontented workers at home might turn to radicalism. Yet America's broad prosperity and its tradition of federal compromise blunted the appeal. Labor unions gained recognition, governments introduced protections for workers, and massive infrastructure programs connected cities with highways, dams, and electrified networks. The government embraced reform not as a concession to revolution, but as a continuation of the Republican experiment, ensuring that prosperity reached every region. Without the devastation of world wars, without the humiliation of depression, and without the scars of racial segregation and law, the Union entered the second half of the century with unmatched confidence. While Europe rebuilt from ruins and Asia struggled under conflict, America expanded its universities, laboratories, and industries. Scientific breakthroughs flowed freely. Aviation, rocketry, and medicine surged ahead, powered by minds drawn from every corner of the globe. Immigrants fleeing turmoil found safety and opportunity in the Republic, adding to its brilliance. The Cold War that defined our reality never ignited here, for without American intervention in Europe, the Soviet Union never rose to dominate half the continent. Russia remained fractured and unstable, its revolutions contested, but never producing a monolithic power. Instead, Europe was a patchwork of weakened empires and fragile republics, while the Americas, under the Union's shadow, became the most stable and prosperous hemisphere on Earth. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Union numbered nearly 600 million souls, a federation of states stretching over mountains, deserts, tundras, and tropics, bound together not by sameness, but by a shared belief that liberty could endure across difference. Its cities were vibrant and safe, its economy unmatched, its military powerful, yet rarely used beyond the hemisphere. The world looked on with a mixture of envy and awe. Some called it a paradise, others warned it was an empire in all but name. Yet within the Union, debates continued. What did it mean to be American? Was it the farmer in Alberta, the dock worker in Veracruz, the jazz musician in New Orleans, the engineer in San Francisco, or the poet in Quebec? In truth, it was all of them. The experiment had succeeded, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with resilience. By embracing diversity earlier, by avoiding civil war, and by choosing commerce over conquest, the Union had become something unique in human history, a continental republic that grew into a global beacon without ever losing sight of its foundations. And so, as the new millennium dawned, the people of this alternate America looked to the horizon not with fear, but with confidence. They believed that destiny was not written in bloodshed or empire, but in unity and innovation, and they carried forward a republic larger and more diverse than any before, yet still true to its guiding vision that liberty was the birthright of all who called it home.